This Shabbat, we travel back to the beginning, the very opening chapters of Genesis and the account of creation. Most of this week's Torah portion is familiar to even the most casual student of the Bible. We all know it well, how God created the universe in 7 days, planted Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, commanded them to reject the forbidden fruit, then punished them for their disobedience. But more often than not, familiar stories can fool us into believing that this story is a feeble attempt of ancient people to explain the origins of life, which they actually knew nothing about since they were not the beneficiaries of modern science. But the Torah's account of creation was never intended to be science. It was meant to teach timeless lessons. I just want to share 2 of those timeless lessons with you tonight. First, the most sacred document of the Jewish people, our Bible, the Hebrew Bible, does not begin with the Jewish people. It begins with humanity. Adam and Eve were not Jewish. They were any man and every woman. They belonged to all people in all places for all time. That's why these 3 radiant singers in Oseh Shalom, you may have heard another line, they sang Al Yoshvei Tevel, all the people on the earth. Adam and Eve belong to all people in all places for all time. In Hebrew, the name Adam, is simply the generic term for a human being. The early rabbis were fond of emphasizing that in the beginning, God created only one person so that no one thereafter could say, my ancestors were better than yours, because we are all descended from the same individual. On Rosh Hashanah, which seems like eons ago, 3 weeks or so ago, we measure time in our Hebrew calendar not from the birth of the Jewish people, but from the beginning of the world. The first Jews, Abraham and Sarah, they don't show up in the Bible until chapter 12. Until then, our biblical ancestors are not Jewish ancestors. They are our human ancestors, including Cain and Abel, and Noah, next week's portion, and his family, and everybody else who lived in the world at the time. Our Jewish sacred literature assigns its highest priority not to our Jewish roots, but to our human roots. Universalism, then, is a fundamental precept of the Hebrew Bible and of Judaism. When we said Adonai Echad, we mean that just as there is only one God in heaven, there can only be one humanity on earth. God is not on anybody's side, either in war or at tonight's football games or on election day. As the rabbis taught, God is anywhere we decide to let God in. That's one timeless lesson. Second, fundamental precept of the creation narrative in the Torah this week, besides universalism, is the notion of wonder and amazement. The essential act of faith is that spark of awe and reverence for the mystery of all being. That's where the religious impulse begins, and that is why the Torah account of creation does not include any dogma or doctrine. All it is designed to evoke is a feeling of awe and amazement. Much of religion nowadays, sad to say, makes wonder, awe, and amazement rather difficult because most religions are obsessed with ideology, uniformity, loyalty, favoritism. An agenda of that kind is not a helpful blueprint for living a life that embraces a sense of awe and mystery. Being attuned to awe and wonder also precludes petitions to God for special favors or protection. The God of Bereshit this week is not a deity that micromanages the universe, that responds to every human demand. In Torah terms, to be divine is to design, to create the fabric and texture of all living things. But what people do and who they become is the consequence of people's decisions. In one sentence, or 2 sentences, God's gift to us is the miracle of life. What we do with that miracle is our gift to God. Now, I hope you're listening because the timelessness of these teachings could not be clearer. One would like to think that God is on our side against others because others are evil and we are righteous. And any deity worth his salt could tell the difference. But the rabbis had trouble with that proposition because the same kind of thinking can lead people to believe that God created them in his own image too. These early rabbis suggest that the Hebrew term which we translate in God's image, Bitsalmo, may actually not refer to God, but to our highest humanity. Being created Bitsalmenu, therefore, requires us to strive for the best possible human qualities, which may still be far less than divine ones, the human power of people themselves to distinguish between good and evil. That's a key lesson of Adam and Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden. They now know the difference between the two. And the price of that knowledge is the inevitable pain and suffering that results, listen up kids, from making wrong decisions. God created us with the freedom to regulate ourselves, and we reciprocate by freeing God of that responsibility. In short, we're like grown children who no longer hold our parents responsible for all of our own mistakes. If maturity means we can no longer blame our parents for all of our faults, surely we cannot blame God either. When it comes to knowing the difference between good and evil, the Torah teaches that we are responsible, not God or some outside force. God's gift to us is the awe, wonder, and miracle of life. What we do with that miracle is our gift to God. Just one more example before I close. At the outbreak of World War II, the great Protestant theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer made his way to America from Nazi Germany. Shortly after, he decided to return to Germany to join the resistance. He participated in a failed attempt to assassinate Hitler. He was caught, jailed, executed by hanging. And Bonhoeffer addressed this question of awe with the example of a rose. He said that science allows us to grasp nearly everything that can be known about the composition of a rose because we have learned so much about pollination, photosynthesis, and so forth. And yet, he said, once we have done all that analysis, we still ask, what is a rose? Science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion, we learned this week, puts things together to see what they mean. Clearly, we need both. But Hitler had a different question. Who says, he asked, that I am not under the special protection of God? And the answer to that question is not in God's hands, but in ours and ours alone. Awe and amazement do not require us to believe that we know the mind of God. They require us only to protect and defend the truth as we know it. And that truth, as we learn this week, and as Adam Nathan will chant tomorrow morning, is the irrefutable proposition that there can only be one humanity on earth, even as there is only one God in heaven. In Judaism, that proposition is what we stand for and what we live for. And in the spirit of this week's Torah portion, we truly believe God's creation depends on it. It is this week in the Torah when we are reminded that humans were created to become shutafim lama'aseh bereshit, God's partners in the ongoing work of creation. Ken nihiyeh, so may we become. And let us say,